Clairvoyance by C.W. Leadbeater, originally published in 1899, this work is now under the public domain. Infinite thanks to all involved in the inspiration, writing, and publishing of this magnificent work of literature. This audiobook has been created for the purpose of research and discussion, and the views and opinions stated are those of the author, and do not necessarily reflect those of the Sophia Speaks audio library. May all who listen be rightly guided in discernment from the divine power within. Beginning of Clairvoyance, Chapter 1. What clairvoyance is. Clairvoyance means literally nothing more than clear seeing, and it is a word which has been sorely misused, and even degraded so far as to be employed to describe the trickery of a mountebank in a variety show. Even in its more restricted sense, it covers a wide range of phenomena, differing so greatly in character that it is not easy to give a definition of the word which shall be at once succinct and accurate. It has been called spiritual vision, but no rendering could well be more misleading than that, for in the vast majority of cases there is no faculty connected with it which has the slightest claim to be honored by so lofty a name. For the purpose of this treatise we may, perhaps, define it as the power to see what is hidden from ordinary physical sight. It will be as well to premise 6, that it is very frequently, though by no means always, accompanied by what is called clairaudience, or the power to hear what would be inaudible to the ordinary physical ear, and we will for the nonce take our title as covering this faculty also, in order to avoid the clumsiness of perpetually using two long words where one will suffice. Let me make 2 points clear before I begin. First, I am not writing for those who do not believe that there is such a thing as clairvoyance, nor am I seeking to convince those who are in doubt about the matter. In so small a work as this I have no space for that. Such people must study the many books containing lists of cases, or make experiments for themselves along mesmeric lines. I am addressing myself to the better instructed class, who know that clairvoyance exists, and are sufficiently interested in the subject to be glad of information as to its methods and possibilities, and I would assure them that what I write is the result of much careful study and experiment, and that though some of the powers, which I shall have to describe may seem new and wonderful to them, I mention no single one of which I have not myself seen examples. Secondly, though I shall endeavor to avoid technicalities as far as possible, yet as I am writing in the main for students of theosophy, I shall feel myself at liberty sometimes to use, for brevity's sake and with 7-out detailed explanation, the ordinary theosophical terms with which I may safely assume them to be familiar. Should this little book fall into the hands of any to whom the occasional use of such terms constitutes a difficulty, I can only apologize to them, and refer them for these preliminary explanations to any elementary theosophical work, such as Mrs. Besant's Ancient Wisdom or Man and His Bodies. The truth is that the whole theosophical system hangs together so closely, and its various parts are so interdependent, that to give a full explanation of every term used would necessitate an exhaustive treatise on theosophy, as a preface even to this short account of clairvoyance. Before a detailed explanation of clairvoyance can usefully be attempted, however, it will be necessary for us to devote a little time to some preliminary considerations, in order that we may have clearly in mind a few broad facts as to the different planes on which clairvoyant vision may be exercised, and the conditions which render its exercise possible. We are constantly assured in theosophical literature that all these higher faculties are presently to be the heritage of mankind in general, that the capacity of clairvoyance, for example, lies latent in every one, and that those in whom it already manifests itself are simply in that one particular a little in advance of the rest of us. Now this statement is a true one, and yet it seems quite vague and unreal to the majority of people, simply because they regard such a faculty as something absolutely different from anything they have yet experienced, and feel fairly confident that they themselves, at any rate, are not within measurable distance of its development. It may help to dispel this sense of unreality if we try to understand that clairvoyance, like so many other things in nature, is mainly a question of vibrations, and is in fact nothing but an extension of powers which we are all using every day of our lives. We are living all the while surrounded by a vast sea of mingled air and ether, the latter interpenetrating the former, as it does all physical matter, and it is chiefly by means of vibrations, in that vast sea of matter, that impressions reach us from the outside. This much we all know, but it may perhaps never have occurred to many of us that the number of these vibrations to which we are capable of responding is in reality quite infinitesimal. Up among the exceedingly rapid vibrations which affect the ether, there is a certain small section, a very small section, to which the retina of the human eye is capable of responding, and these particular vibrations produce in us the sensation which we call light. That is to say, we are capable of seeing only those objects from which light of that particular kind can either issue or be reflected. 9. In exactly the same way, the tympanum of the human ear is capable of responding to a certain very small range of comparatively slow vibrations, slow enough to affect the air which surrounds us, and so the only sounds which we can hear are those made by objects which are able to vibrate at some rate within that particular range. In both cases, it is a matter perfectly well known to science that there are large numbers of vibrations both above and below these two sections, and that consequently there is much light that we cannot see, and there are many sounds to which our ears are deaf. In the case of light, the action of these higher and lower vibrations is easily perceptible in the effects produced by the actinic rays at one end of the spectrum and the heat rays at the other. As a matter of fact, there exist vibrations of every conceivable degree of rapidity, filling the whole vast space intervening between the slow sound waves and the swift light waves, nor is even that all, for there are undoubtedly vibrations slower than those of sound, and a whole infinity of them which are swifter than those known to us as light. So we begin to understand that the vibrations by which we see and hear are only like two tiny groups of a few strings selected from an enormous harp of practically infinite extent, and when we think how much we have been able to learn and infer from the use of those minute 10 fragments, we see vaguely what possibilities might lie before us if we were enabled to utilize the vast and wonderful whole. Another fact which needs to be considered in this connection is that different human beings vary considerably, though within relatively narrow limits, in their capacity of response even to the very few vibrations which are within reach of our physical senses. I am not referring to the keenness of sight or of hearing that enables one man to see a fainter object or hear a slighter sound than another. It is not in the least a question of strength of vision, but of extent of susceptibility. For example, if anyone will take a good bisulfide of carbon prism, and by its means throw a clear spectrum on a sheet of white paper, and then get a number of people to mark upon the paper the extreme limits of the spectrum as it appears to them, he is fairly certain to find that their powers of vision differ appreciably. Some will see the violet extending much farther than the majority do, others will perhaps see rather less violet than most, while gaining a corresponding extension of vision at the red end. Some few there will perhaps be who can see farther than ordinary at both ends, and these will almost certainly be what we call sensitive people, susceptible in fact to a greater range of vibrations than are most men of the present day. 11. In hearing, the same difference can be tested by taking some sound, which is just not too high to be audible on the very verge of audibility, as it were, and discovering how many among a given number of people are able to hear it. The squeak of a bat is a familiar instance of such a sound, and experiment will show that on a summer evening, when the whole air is full of the shrill, needle-like cries of these little animals, quite a large number of men will be absolutely unconscious of them, and unable to hear anything at all. Now these examples clearly show that there is no hard and fast limit to man's power of response to either etheric or aerial vibrations, but that some among us already have that power to a wider extent than others, and it will even be found that the same man's capacity varies on different occasions. It is therefore not difficult for us to imagine that it might be possible for a man to develop this power, and thus in time to learn to see much that is invisible to his fellow men, and hear much that is inaudible to them, since we know perfectly well that enormous numbers of these additional vibrations do exist, and are simply, as it were, awaiting recognition. The experiments with the Röntgen rays give us an example of the startling results, which are produced when even a very few of these additional vibrations are brought within human ken, and the transparency 12, to these rays of many substances hitherto considered opaque at once shows us one way at least, in which we may explain such elementary clairvoyance as is involved in reading a letter inside a closed box, or describing those present in an adjoining apartment. To learn to see by means of the Röntgen rays in addition to those ordinarily employed, would be quite sufficient to enable anyone to perform a feat of magic of this order. So far we have thought only of an extension of the purely physical senses of man, and when we remember that a man's etheric body is in reality merely the finer part of his physical frame, and that therefore all his sense organs contain a large amount of etheric matter of various degrees of density, the capacities of which are still practically latent in most of us, we shall see that even if we confine ourselves to this line of development alone, there are enormous possibilities of all kinds already opening out before us. But besides and beyond all this, we know that man possesses an astral and a mental body, each of which can in process of time be aroused into activity, and will respond in turn to the vibrations of the matter of its own plane, thus opening up before the ego, as he learns to function through these vehicles, two entirely new and far wider worlds of knowledge and power. Now these new worlds, though they are all around us and freely interpenetrate one another, 13, are not to be thought of as distinct and entirely unconnected in substance, but rather as melting the one into the other, the lowest astral forming a direct series with the highest physical, just as the lowest mental in its turn forms a direct series with the highest astral. We are not called upon in thinking of them to imagine some new and strange kind of matter, but simply to think of the ordinary physical kind as subdivided so very much more finely, and vibrating so very much more rapidly, as to introduce us to what are practically entirely new conditions and qualities. It is not then difficult for us to grasp the possibility of a steady and progressive extension of our senses, so that both by sight and by hearing we may be able to appreciate vibrations far higher and far lower than those which are ordinarily recognized. A large section of these additional vibrations will still belong to the physical plane, and will merely enable us to obtain impressions from the etheric part of that plane, which is at present as a closed book to us. Such impressions will still be received through the retina of the eye. Of course they will affect its etheric rather than its solid matter, but we may nevertheless regard them as still appealing only to an organ specialized to receive them, and not to the whole surface of the etheric body. There are some abnormal cases, however, in which other parts of the etheric body respond to these addi-14tional vibrations as readily as, or even more readily than, the eye. Such vagaries are explicable in various ways, but principally as effects of some partial astral development, for it will be found that the sensitive parts of the body almost invariably correspond with one or other of the chakrams, or centers of vitality in the astral body. And though, if astral consciousness be not yet developed, these centers may not be available on their own plane, they are still strong enough to stimulate into keener activity the etheric matter which they interpenetrate. When we come to deal with the astral senses themselves, the methods of working are very different. The astral body has no specialized sense organs, a fact which perhaps needs some explanation, since many students who are trying to comprehend its physiology seem to find it difficult to reconcile with the statements that have been made as to the perfect interpenetration of the physical body by astral matter, the exact correspondence between the two vehicles, and the fact that every physical object has necessarily its astral counterpart. Now all these statements are true, and yet it is quite possible for people who do not normally see astrally to misunderstand them. Every order of physical matter has its corresponding order of astral matter in constant association with it, not to be separated from it except by a very considerable 15 exertion of occult force, and even then only to be held apart from it as long as force is being definitely exerted to that end. But for all that the relation of the astral particles one to another is far looser than is the case with their physical correspondences. In a bar of iron, for example, we have a mass of physical molecules in the solid condition, that is to say, capable of comparatively little change in their relative positions, though each vibrating with immense rapidity in its own sphere. The astral counterpart of this consists of what we often call solid astral matter, that is, matter of the lowest and densest subplane of the astral, but nevertheless its particles are constantly and rapidly changing their relative position, moving among one another as easily as those of a liquid on the physical plane might do. so that there is no permanent association between any one physical particle and that amount of astral matter which happens at any given moment to be acting as its counterpart. This is equally true with respect to the astral body of man, which for our purpose at the moment we may regard as consisting of two parts: the denser aggregation which occupies the exact position of the physical body, and the cloud of rarer astral matter which surrounds that aggregation. In both these parts, and between them both, there is going on at every moment of time the rapid intercirculation of the 16 particles which has been described, so that as one watches the movement of the molecules in the astral body one is reminded of the appearance of those in fiercely boiling water. This being so, it will be readily understood that though any given organ of the physical body must always have as its counterpart a certain amount of astral matter, it does not retain the same particles for more than a few seconds at a time, and consequently there is nothing corresponding to the specialization of physical nerve matter into optic or auditory nerves, and so on. So that though the physical eye or ear has undoubtedly always its counterpart of astral matter, that particular fragment of astral matter is no more, and no less, capable of responding to the vibrations which produce astral sight or astral hearing than any other part of the vehicle. It must never be forgotten that though we constantly have to speak of astral sight or astral hearing in order to make ourselves intelligible, all that we mean by those expressions is the faculty of responding to such vibrations as convey to the man's consciousness, when he is functioning in his astral body, information of the same character as that conveyed to him by his eyes and ears while he is in the physical body. But in the entirely different astral conditions, specialized organs are not necessary for the attainment of this result. There is matter in 17, every part of the astral body, which is capable of such response, and consequently the man functioning in that vehicle sees equally well objects behind him, beneath him, above him, without needing to turn his head. There is, however, another point which it would hardly be fair to leave entirely out of account, and that is the question of the chakrams referred to above. Theosophical students are familiar with the idea of the existence in both the astral and the etheric bodies of man of certain centers of force, which have to be vivified in turn by the sacred serpent fire as the man advances in evolution. Though these cannot be described as organs in the ordinary sense of the word, since it is not through them that the man sees or hears, as he does in physical life through eyes and ears, yet it is apparently very largely upon their vivification that the power of exercising these astral senses depends, each of them as it is developed giving to the whole astral body the power of response to a new set of vibrations. Neither have these centers, however, any permanent collection of astral matter connected with them. They are simply vortices in the matter of the body, vortices through which all the particles pass in turn points, perhaps, at which the higher force from planes above impinges upon the astral body. Even this description gives but a very partial idea of their 18 appearance, for they are in reality four-dimensional vortices, so that the force which comes through them, and is the cause of their existence, seems to well up from nowhere. But at any rate, since all particles in turn pass through each of them, it will be clear that it is thus possible for each in turn to evoke in all the particles of the body the power of receptivity to a certain set of vibrations, so that all the astral senses are equally active in all parts of the body. The vision of the mental plane is again totally different, for in this case we can no longer speak of separate senses such as sight and hearing, but rather have to postulate one general sense which responds so fully to the vibrations reaching it that when any object comes within its cognition it at once comprehends it fully, and as it were sees it, hears it, feels it, and knows all there is to know about it by the one instantaneous operation. Yet even this wonderful faculty differs in degree only, and not in kind, from those which are at our command at the present time. On the mental plane, just as on the physical, impressions are still conveyed by means of vibrations traveling from the object seen to the seer. On the Buddhic plane we meet for the first time with a quite new faculty having nothing in common with those of which we have spoken, for there a man cognizes any object by an entirely different method, in which external vibrations play no part. The 19 object becomes part of himself, and he studies it from the inside instead of from the outside. But with this power, ordinary clairvoyance has nothing to do. The development, either entire or partial, of any one of these faculties would come under our definition of clairvoyance, the power to see what is hidden from ordinary physical sight. But these faculties may be developed in various ways, and it will be well to say a few words as to these different lines. We may presume that if it were possible for a man to be isolated during his evolution from all but the gentlest outside influences, and to unfold from the beginning in perfectly regular and normal fashion, he would probably develop his senses in regular order also. He would find his physical senses gradually extending their scope until they responded to all the physical vibrations, of etheric as well as of denser matter. Then in orderly sequence would come sensibility to the coarser part of the astral plane, and presently the finer part also would be included, until in due course the faculty of the mental plane dawned in its turn. In real life, however, development so regular as this is hardly ever known, and many a man has occasional flashes of astral consciousness without any awakening of etheric vision at all. And this irregularity of development is one of the principal causes of man's extraordinary liability to error in matters. 20. Of clairvoyance, a liability from which there is no escape except by a long course of careful training under a qualified teacher. Students of theosophical literature are well aware that there are such teachers to be found, that even in this materialistic 19th century the old saying is still true, that when the pupil is ready, the master is ready also, and that in the hall of learning, when he is capable of entering there, the disciple will always find his master. They are well aware also that only under such guidance can a man develop his latent powers in safety and with certainty, since they know how fatally easy it is for the untrained clairvoyant to deceive himself as to the meaning and value of what he sees, or even absolutely to distort his vision completely in bringing it down into his physical consciousness. It does not follow that even the pupil who is receiving regular instruction in the use of occult powers will find them unfolding themselves exactly in the regular order which was suggested above as probably ideal. His previous progress may not have been such as to make this for him the easiest or most desirable road. But at any rate he is in the hands of one who is perfectly competent to be his guide in spiritual development, and he rests in perfect contentment that the way along which he has taken will be that which is the best way for him. 21. Another great advantage which he gains is that whatever faculties he may acquire are definitely under his command, and can be used fully and constantly when he needs them for his theosophical work, whereas in the case of the untrained man such powers often manifest themselves only very partially and spasmodically, and appear to come and go, as it were, at their own sweet will. It may reasonably be objected that if clairvoyant faculty is, as stated, a part of the occult development of man, and so a sign of a certain amount of progress along that line, it seems strange that it should often be possessed by primitive peoples, or by the ignorant and uncultured among our own race persons, who are obviously quite undeveloped, from whatever point of view one regards them. No doubt this does appear remarkable at first sight, but the fact is that the sensitiveness of the savage or of the coarse and vulgar European ignoramus is not really at all the same thing as the faculty of his properly trained brother, nor is it arrived at in the same way. An exact and detailed explanation of the difference would lead us into rather recondite technicalities, but perhaps the general idea of the distinction between the two may be caught from an example taken from the very lowest plane of clairvoyance, in close contact with the denser physical. The etheric double in man is in exceedingly close relation to his nervous system. 22, and any kind of action upon one of them speedily reacts on the other. Now in the sporadic appearance of etheric sight in the savage, whether of Central Africa or of Western Europe, it has been observed that the corresponding nervous disturbance is almost entirely in the sympathetic system, and that the whole affair is practically beyond the man's control, is in fact a sort of massive sensation vaguely belonging to the whole etheric body, rather than an exact and definite sense perception communicated through a specialized organ. As in later races and amid higher development, the strength of the man is more and more thrown into the evolution of the mental faculties. This vague sensitiveness usually disappears, but still later, when the spiritual man begins to unfold, he regains his clairvoyant power. This time, however, The faculty is a precise and exact one, under the control of the man's will, and exercised through a definite sense organ, and it is noteworthy that any nervous action set up in sympathy with it is now almost exclusively in the cerebrospinal system. On this subject Mrs. Besant writes, "The lower forms of psychism are more frequent in animals, and in very unintelligent human beings than in men and women in whom the intellectual powers are well developed. They appear to be connected with the sympathetic system, not with the cerebrospinal." 23. The large nucleated ganglionic cells in this system contain a very large proportion of etheric matter, and are hence more easily affected by the coarser astral vibrations than other cells in which the proportion is less. As the cerebrospinal system develops, and the brain becomes more highly evolved, the sympathetic system subsides into a subordinate position, and the sensitiveness to psychic vibrations is dominated by the stronger and more active vibrations of the higher nervous system. It is true that at a later stage of evolution psychic sensitiveness reappears, but it is then developed in connection with the cerebrospinal centers, and is brought under the control of the will. But the hysterical and ill-regulated psychism of which we see so many lamentable examples is due to the small development of the brain, and the dominance of the sympathetic system. Occasional flashes of clairvoyance do, however, sometimes come to the highly cultured and spiritual-minded man, even though he may never have heard of the possibility of training such a faculty. In his case such glimpses usually signify that he is approaching that stage in his evolution when these powers will naturally begin to manifest themselves, and their appearance should serve as an additional stimulus to him to strive to maintain that high standard of moral purity and mental balance without which clairvoyance is a curse, and not a blessing to its possessor. 24. Between those who are entirely unimpressible, and those who are in full possession of clairvoyant power, there are many intermediate stages. One to which it will be worthwhile to give a passing glance is the stage in which a man, though he has no clairvoyant faculty in ordinary life, yet exhibits it more or less fully, under the influence of mesmerism. This is a case in which the psychic nature is already sensitive, but the consciousness is not yet capable of functioning in it amidst the manifold distractions of physical life. It needs to be set free by the temporary suspension of the outer senses in the mesmeric trance before it can use the diviner faculties which are but just beginning to dawn within it. But of course even in the mesmeric trance there are innumerable degrees of lucidity, from the ordinary patient who is blankly unintelligent to the man whose power of sight is fully under the control of the operator, and can be directed whithersoever he wills, or to the more advanced stage in which, when the consciousness is once set free, it escapes altogether from the grasp of the magnetizer, and soars into fields of exalted vision where it is entirely beyond his reach. Another step along the same path is that upon which such perfect suppression of the physical as that which occurs in the hypnotic trance is not necessary, but the power of supernormal sight, though still out of reach during waking life, becomes available when 25, the body is held in the bonds of ordinary sleep. At this stage of development stood many of the prophets and seers of whom we read, who were warned of God in a dream, or communed with beings far higher than themselves in the silent watches of the night. Most cultured people of the higher races of the world have this development to some extent, that is to say, the senses of their astral bodies are in full working order, and perfectly capable of receiving impressions from objects and entities of their own plane. But to make that fact of any use to them down here in the physical body, two changes are usually necessary. First, that the ego shall be awakened to the realities of the astral plane, and induced to emerge from the chrysalis formed by his own waking thoughts, and look round him to observe and to learn, and secondly, that the consciousness shall be so far retained during the return of the ego into his physical body, as to enable him to impress upon his physical brain the recollection of what he has seen or learnt. If the first of these changes has taken place, the second is of little importance, since the ego, the true man, will be able to profit by the information to be obtained upon that plane, even though he may not have the satisfaction of bringing through any remembrance of it into his waking life down here. Students often ask how this clairvoyant faculty will first be manifested in themselves, how they may 26, know when they have reached the stage at which its first faint foreshadowings are beginning to be visible. Cases differ so widely that it is impossible to give to this question any answer that will be universally applicable. Some people begin by a plunge, as it were, and under some unusual stimulus become able just for once to see some striking vision, and very often in such a case, because the experience does not repeat itself, the seer comes in time to believe that on that occasion he must have been the victim of hallucination. Others begin by becoming intermittently conscious of the brilliant colors and vibrations of the human aura, yet others find themselves with increasing frequency seeing and hearing something to which those around them are blind and deaf. Others, again, see faces, landscapes, or colored clouds floating before their eyes in the dark before they sink to rest, while perhaps the commonest experience of all is that of those who begin to recollect with greater and greater clearness what they have seen and heard on the other planes during sleep. Having now to some extent cleared our ground, we may proceed to consider the various phenomena of clairvoyance. They differ so widely both in character and in degree that it is not very easy to decide how they can most satisfactorily be classified. We might, for 27, example, arrange them according to the kind of sight employed, whether it were mental, astral, or merely etheric. We might divide them according to the capacity of the clairvoyant, taking into consideration whether he was trained or untrained, whether his vision was regular, and under his command, or spasmodic and independent of his volition, whether he could exercise it only when under mesmeric influence, or whether that assistance was unnecessary for him, whether he was able to use his faculty when awake in the physical body, or whether it was available only when he was temporarily away from that body in sleep or trance. All these distinctions are of importance, and we shall have to take them all into consideration as we go on. But perhaps on the whole the most useful classification will be one something on the lines of that adopted by Mr. Sinnett in his Rationale of Mesmerism, a book, by the way, which all students of clairvoyance ought to read. In dealing with the phenomena, then, we will arrange them rather according to the capacity of the sight employed than to the plane upon which it is exercised, so that we may group instances of clairvoyance under some such headings as these. 1. Simple clairvoyance, that is to say, a mere opening of sight, enabling its possessor to see whatever astral or etheric entities happen to be present 28 around him, but not including the power of observing either distant places or scenes belonging to any other time than the present. 2. Clairvoyance in space, the capacity to see scenes or events removed from the seer in space, and either too far distant for ordinary observation or concealed by intermediate objects. 3. Clairvoyance in time, that is to say, the capacity to see objects or events which are removed from the seer in time, or, in other words, the power of looking into the past or the future. 29. Chapter 2. Simple clairvoyance, full. We have defined this as a mere opening of etheric or astral sight, which enables the possessor to see whatever may be present around him on corresponding levels, but is not usually accompanied by the power of seeing anything at a great distance, or of reading either the past or the future. It is hardly possible altogether to exclude these latter faculties, for astral sight necessarily has considerably greater extension than physical, and fragmentary pictures of both past and future are often casually visible even to clairvoyants, who do not know how to seek specially for them. But there is nevertheless a very real distinction between such incidental glimpses, and the definite power of projection of the sight either in space or time. We find among sensitive people all degrees of this kind of clairvoyance, from that of the man who gets a vague impression which hardly deserves the name of sight at all, up to the full possession of etheric and 30, astral vision respectively. Perhaps the simplest method will be for us to begin by describing what would be visible in the case of this fuller development of the power, as the cases of its partial possession will then be seen to fall naturally into their places. Let us take the etheric vision first. This consists simply, as has already been said, in susceptibility to a far larger series of physical vibrations than ordinary, but nevertheless its possession brings into view a good deal to which the majority of the human race still remains blind. Let us consider what changes its acquisition produces in the aspect of familiar objects, animate and inanimate, and then see to what entirely new factors it introduces us. But it must be remembered that what I am about to describe is the result of the full and perfectly controlled possession of the faculty only, and that most of the instances met with in real life will be likely to fall far short of it in one direction or another. The most striking change produced in the appearance of inanimate objects by the acquisition of this faculty is that most of them become almost transparent, owing to the difference in wavelength of some of the vibrations to which the man has now become susceptible. He finds himself capable of performing with the utmost ease the proverbial feat of seeing through a brick wall, for to his newly acquired vision the brick wall seems to have a consistency no greater than that of a light mist. He therefore sees what is going on in an adjoining room almost as though no intervening wall existed. He can describe with accuracy the contents of a locked box, or read a sealed letter. With a little practice he can find a given passage in a closed book. This last feat, though perfectly easy to astral vision, presents considerable difficulty to one using etheric sight, because of the fact that each page has to be looked at through all those which happen to be superimposed upon it. It is often asked whether under these circumstances a man sees always with this abnormal sight, or only when he wishes to do so. The answer is that if the faculty is perfectly developed it will be entirely under his control, and he can use that or his more ordinary vision at will. He changes from one to the other as readily and naturally as we now change the focus of our eyes, when we look up from our book to follow the motions of some object a mile away. It is, as it were, a focusing of consciousness on the one or the other aspect of what is seen, and though the man would have quite clearly in his view the aspect upon which his attention was for the moment fixed, he would always be vaguely conscious of the other aspect too, just as when we focus our sight upon any object held in our hands we yet vaguely see the opposite wall of the room as a background. 32. Another curious change, which comes from the possession of this sight, is that the solid ground upon which the man walks becomes to a certain extent transparent to him, so that he is able to see down into it to a considerable depth, much as we can now see into fairly clear water. This enables him to watch a creature burrowing underground, to distinguish a vein of coal or of metal if not too far below the surface, and so on. The limit of etheric sight when looking through solid matter appears to be analogous to that imposed upon us when looking through water or mist. We cannot see beyond a certain distance, because the medium through which we are looking is not perfectly transparent. The appearance of animate objects is also considerably altered for the man who has increased his visual powers to this extent. The bodies of men and animals are for him in the main transparent, so that he can watch the action of the various internal organs, and to some extent diagnose some of their diseases. The extended sight also enables him to perceive, more or less clearly, various classes of creatures, elemental and otherwise, whose bodies are not capable of reflecting any of the rays within the limit of the spectrum as ordinarily seen. Among the entities so seen will be some of the lower orders of nature spirits, those whose bodies are composed of 33, the denser etheric matter. To this class belong nearly all the fairies, gnomes, and brownies, about whom there are still so many stories remaining among Scotch and Irish mountains, and in remote country places all over the world. The vast kingdom of nature spirits is in the main an astral kingdom, but still there is a large section of it which appertains to the etheric part of the physical plane, and this section, of course, is much more likely to come within the ken of ordinary people than the others. Indeed, in reading the common fairy stories one frequently comes across distinct indications that it is with this class that we are dealing. Any student of fairy lore will remember how often mention is made of some mysterious ointment or drug, which when applied to a man's eyes enables him to see the members of the fairy commonwealth whenever he happens to meet them. The story of such an application, and its results occurs so constantly, and comes from so many different parts of the world that there must certainly be some truth behind it, as there always is behind really universal popular tradition. Now no such anointing of the eyes alone could by any possibility open a man's astral vision, though certain ointments rubbed over the whole body will very greatly assist the astral body to leave the physical in full consciousness, a fact the knowledge of which seems to have survived 34, even to medieval times, as will be seen from the evidence given at some of the trials for witchcraft. But the application to the physical eye might very easily so stimulate its sensitiveness as to make it susceptible to some of the etheric vibrations. The story frequently goes on to relate how when the human being who has used this mystical ointment betrays his extended vision in some way to a fairy, the latter strikes or stabs him in the eye, thus depriving him not only of the etheric sight, but of that of the denser physical plane as well. See The Science of Fairy Tales, by E.S. Hartland, in the Contemporary Science series, or indeed almost any extensive collection of fairy stories. If the sight acquired had been astral, such a proceeding would have been entirely unavailing, for no injury to the physical apparatus would affect an astral faculty. But if the vision produced by the ointment were etheric, the destruction of the physical eye would in most cases at once extinguish it, since that is the mechanism by means of which it works. Anyone possessing this sight of which we are speaking would also be able to perceive the etheric double of man, but since this is so nearly identical in size with the physical, it would hardly be likely to attract his attention unless it were partially projected in trance or under the influence of anesthetics. After death, when it withdraws entirely from the dense 35 body, it would be clearly visible to him, and he would frequently see it hovering over newly made graves as he passed through a churchyard or cemetery. If he were to attend a spiritualistic séance, he would see the etheric matter oozing out from the side of the medium, and could observe the various ways in which the communicating entities make use of it. Another fact which could hardly fail soon to thrust itself upon his notice would be the extension of his perception of color. He would find himself able to see several entirely new colors, not in the least resembling any of those included in the spectrum as we at present know it, and therefore of course quite indescribable in any terms at our command. And not only would he see new objects that were wholly of these new colors, but he would also discover that modifications had been introduced into the color of many objects with which he was quite familiar, according to whether they had or had not some tinge of these new hues intermingled with the old. So that two surfaces of color which to ordinary eyes appeared to match perfectly would often present distinctly different shades to his keener sight. We have now touched upon some of the principal changes which would be introduced into a man's world when he gained etheric sight, and it must always be remembered that in most cases a Core 36 bonding change would at the same time be brought about in his other senses also, so that he would be capable of hearing, and perhaps even of feeling, more than most of those around him. Now supposing that in addition to this he obtained the sight of the astral plane, what further changes would be observable? Well, the changes would be many and great. In fact, a whole new world would open before his eyes. Let us consider its wonders briefly in the same order as before, and see first what difference there would be in the appearance of inanimate objects. On this point I may begin by quoting a recent quaint answer given in the Vahan. There is a distinct difference between etheric sight and astral sight, and it is the latter which seems to correspond to the fourth dimension. The easiest way to understand the difference is to take an example. If you looked at a man with both the sights in turn, you would see the buttons at the back of his coat in both cases, only if you used etheric sight you would see them through him, and would see the shank side as nearest to you. But if you looked astrally, you would see it not only like that, but just as if you were standing behind the man as well, or if you were looking etherically at a wooden cube with writing on all its sides, it would be as though the cube were glass, so that you could see 37 through it, and you would see the writing on the opposite side all backwards, while that on the right and left sides would not be clear to you at all unless you moved, because you would see it edgewise. But if you looked at it astrally you would see all the sides at once, and all the right way up, as though the whole cube had been flattened out before you, and you would see every particle of the inside as well, not through the others, but all flattened out. You would be looking at it from another direction, at right angles to all the directions that we know. If you look at the back of a watch etherically you see all the wheels through it, and the face through them. But backwards, if you look at it astrally, you see the face right way up and all the wheels lying separately, but nothing on the top of anything else. Here we have at once the keynote, the principal factor of the change. The man is looking at everything from an absolutely new point of view, entirely outside of anything that he has ever imagined before. He has no longer the slightest difficulty in reading any page in a closed book, because he is not now looking at it through all the other pages before it or behind it, but is looking straight down upon it as though it were the only page to be seen. The depth at which a vein of metal or of coal may lie is no longer a barrier to his sight of it, because he 38 is not now looking through the intervening depth of earth at all. The thickness of a wall, or the number of walls intervening between the observer and the object, would make a great deal of difference to the clearness of the etheric sight. They would make no difference whatever to the astral sight, because on the astral plane they would not intervene between the observer and the object. Of course, that sounds paradoxical and impossible, and it is quite inexplicable to a mind not specially trained to grasp the idea, yet it is nonetheless absolutely true. This carries us straight into the middle of the much vexed question of the fourth dimension, a question of the deepest interest, though one that we cannot pretend to discuss in the space at our disposal. Those who wish to study it as it deserves are recommended to begin with Mr. C.H. Hinton's Scientific Romances or Dr. A.T. Schofield's Another World, and then follow on with the former author's larger work, A New Era of Thought. Mr. Hinton not only claims to be able himself to grasp mentally some of the simpler fourth-dimensional figures, but also states that anyone who will take the trouble to follow out his directions may with perseverance acquire that mental grasp likewise. I am not certain that the power to do this is within the reach of everyone, as he thinks, for it appears to me to require considerable mathematical ability, but I can at any 39 rate bear witness that the tesseract or fourth-dimensional cube, which he describes, is a reality, for it is quite a familiar figure upon the astral plane. He has now perfected a new method of representing the several dimensions by colors instead of by arbitrary written symbols. He states that this will very much simplify the study, as the reader will be able to distinguish instantly by sight any part or feature of the tesseract. A full description of this new method, with plates, is said to be ready for the press, and is expected to appear within a year, so that intending students of this fascinating subject might do well to await its publication. I know that Madame Blavatsky, in alluding to the theory of the fourth dimension, has expressed an opinion that it is only a clumsy way of stating the idea of the entire permeability of matter, and that Mr. W. T. Stead has followed along the same lines, presenting the conception to his readers under the name of truth. Careful, oft-repeated and detailed investigation does, however, seem to show quite conclusively that this explanation does not cover all the facts. It is a perfect description of etheric vision, but the further and quite different idea of the fourth dimension as expounded by Mr. Hinton is the only one which gives any kind of explanation down here of the constantly observed facts of astral vision. I would therefore venture deferentially to suggest that 40, when Madame Blavatsky wrote as she did, she had in mind etheric vision and not astral, and that the extreme applicability of the phrase to this other and higher faculty, of which she was not at the moment thinking, did not occur to her. The possession of this extraordinary and scarcely expressible power, then, must always be borne in mind through all that follows. It lays every point in the interior of every solid body absolutely open to the gaze of the seer, just as every point in the interior of a circle lies open to the gaze of a man looking down upon it. But even this is by no means all that it gives to its possessor. He sees not only the inside as well as the outside of every object, but also its astral counterpart. Every atom and molecule of physical matter has its corresponding astral atoms and molecules, and the mass which is built up out of these is clearly visible to our clairvoyant. Usually the astral of any object projects somewhat beyond the physical part of it, and thus metals, stones and other things are seen surrounded by an astral aura. It will be seen at once that even in the study of inorganic matter a man gains immensely by the acquisition of this vision. Not only does he see the astral part of the object at which he looks, which before was wholly hidden from him, not only does he see much more of its physical constitution than he 41 did before, but even what was visible to him before is now seen much more clearly and truly. A moment's consideration will show that his new vision approximates much more closely to true perception than does physical sight. For example, If he looks astrally at a glass cube, its sides will all appear equal, as we know they really are, whereas on the physical plane he sees the further side in perspective, that is, it appears smaller than the nearer side, which is, of course, a mere illusion due to his physical limitations. When we come to consider the additional facilities which it offers in the observation of animate objects, we see still more clearly the advantages of the astral vision. It exhibits to the clairvoyant the aura of plants and animals, and thus in the case of the latter their desires and emotions, and whatever thoughts they may have, are all plainly shown before his eyes. But it is in dealing with human beings that he will most appreciate the value of this faculty, for he will often be able to help them far more effectually when he guides himself by the information which it gives him. He will be able to see the aura as far up as the astral body, and though that leaves all the higher part of a man still hidden from his gaze, he will nevertheless find it possible by careful observation to learn a good deal about the higher part from what is within 42, his reach. His capacity of examining the etheric double will give him considerable advantage in locating and classifying any defects or diseases of the nervous system, while from the appearance of the astral body, he will be at once aware of all the emotions, passions, desires and tendencies of the man before him, and even of very many of his thoughts also. As he looks at a person, he will see him surrounded by the luminous mist of the astral aura, flashing with all sorts of brilliant colors, and constantly changing in hue and brilliancy with every variation of the person's thoughts and feelings. He will see this aura flooded with the beautiful rose color of pure affection, the rich blue of devotional feeling, the hard, dull brown of selfishness, the deep scarlet of anger, the horrible lurid red of sensuality, the livid gray of fear, the black clouds of hatred and malice, or any of the other hundredfold indications so easily to be read in it by a practiced eye, and thus it will be impossible for any persons to conceal from him the real state of their feelings on any subject. These varied indications of the aura are of themselves a study of very deep interest, but I have no space to deal with them in detail here. A much fuller account of them, together with a large number of colored illustrations, will be found in my work on the subject Man Visible and Invisible. Not only does the astral aura show him the 43, temporary result of the emotion passing through it at the moment, but it also gives him, by the arrangement and proportion of its colors when in a condition of comparative rest, a clue to the general disposition and character of its owner. For the astral body is the expression of as much of the man as can be manifested on that plane, so that from what is seen in it much more which belongs to higher planes may be inferred with considerable certainty. In this judgment of character our clairvoyant will be much helped by so much of the person's thought as expresses itself on the astral plane, and consequently comes within his purview. The true home of thought is on the mental plane, and all thought first manifests itself there as a vibration of the mind-body. But if it be in any way a selfish thought, or if it be connected in any way with an emotion or a desire, it immediately descends into the astral plane, and takes to itself a visible form of astral matter. In the case of the majority of men, almost all thought would fall under one or other of these heads, so that practically the whole of their personality would lie clearly before our friend's astral vision, since their astral bodies, and the thought forms constantly radiating from them would be to him as an open book in which their characteristics were writ so largely that he who ran might read. Anyone wishing to gain some idea as to how the thought forms present them 44 selves to clairvoyant vision may satisfy themselves to some extent by examining the illustrations accompanying Mrs. Besant's valuable article on the subject in Lucifer for September 1896. We have seen something of the alteration in the appearance of both animate and inanimate objects when viewed by one possessed of full clairvoyant sight as far as the astral plane is concerned. Let us now consider what entirely new objects he will see. He will be conscious of a far greater fullness in nature in many directions, but chiefly his attention will be attracted by the living denizens of this new world. No detailed account of them can be attempted within the space at our disposal, for that the reader is referred to no. v. of the Theosophical Manuals. Here we can do no more than barely enumerate a few classes only of the vast hosts of astral inhabitants. He will be impressed by the protean forms of the ceaseless tide of elemental essence, ever swirling around him, menacing often, yet always retiring before a determined effort of the will, he will marvel at the enormous army of entities temporarily called out of this ocean into separate existence by the thoughts and wishes of man, whether good or evil. He will watch the manifold tribes of the nature spirits at their work or at their play. He will sometimes be able to study with ever-increasing delight the magnificent evolution of some of the lower orders of the glorious 45, kingdom of the Devas, which corresponds approximately to the angelic host of Christian terminology, but perhaps of even keener interest to him than any of these will be the human denizens of the astral world, and he will find them divisible into two great classes: those whom we call the living, and those others, most of them infinitely more alive, whom we so foolishly misname the dead. Among the former he will find here and there one wide awake and fully conscious, perhaps sent to bring him some message, or examining him keenly to see what progress he is making, while the majority of his neighbors, when away from their physical bodies during sleep, will drift idly by, so wrapped up in their own cogitations as to be practically unconscious of what is going on around them. Among the great host of the recently dead he will find all degrees of consciousness and intelligence, and all shades of character for death, which seems to our limited vision so absolute a change, in reality alters nothing of the man himself. On the day after his death he is precisely the same man as he was the day before it, with the same disposition, the same qualities, the same virtues and vices, save only that he has cast aside his physical body, but the loss of that no more makes him in any way a different man than would the removal of an overcoat. So among the dead our student will find men intelligent and stupid, 46, kind-hearted and morose, serious and frivolous, spiritually minded and sensually minded, just as among the living. Since he can not only see the dead, but speak with them, he can often be of very great use to them, and give them information and guidance which is of the utmost value to them. Many of them are in a condition of great surprise and perplexity, and sometimes even of acute distress, because they find the facts of the next world so unlike the childish legends, which are all that popular religion in the West has to offer with reference to this transcendently important subject, and therefore a man who understands this new world and can explain matters is distinctly a friend in need. In many other ways a man who fully possesses this faculty may be of use to the living as well as to the dead, but of this side of the subject I have already written in my little book on invisible helpers. In addition to astral entities he will see astral corpses, shades and shells in all stages of decay, but these need only be just mentioned here, as the reader desiring a further account of them will find it in our 3rd and 5th manuals. Another wonderful result which the full enjoyment of astral clairvoyance brings to a man is that he has no longer any break in consciousness. When he lies down at night he leaves his physical body to the rest 47, which it requires, while he goes about his business in the far more comfortable astral vehicle. In the morning he returns to and re-enters his physical body, but without any loss of consciousness or memory between the two states, and thus he is able to live, as it were, a double life which yet is one, and to be usefully employed during the whole of it, instead of losing 1/3 of his existence in blank unconsciousness. Another strange power of which he may find himself in possession, though its full control belongs rather to the still higher devacanic faculty, is that of magnifying the minutest physical or astral particle to any desired size, as though by a microscope, though no microscope ever made or ever likely to be made possesses even 1,000th part of this psychic magnifying power. By its means the hypothetical molecule and atom postulated by science become visible and living realities to the occult student, and on this closer examination he finds them to be much more complex in their structure than the scientific man has yet realized them to be. It also enables him to follow with the closest attention and the most lively interest all kinds of electrical, magnetic, and other etheric action, and when some of the specialists in these branches of science are able to develop the power to see those things whereof they write so facilely, some very wonderful and beautiful revelations may be expected. 48. This is one of the cities or powers described in Oriental books as accruing to the man who devotes himself to spiritual development, though the name under which it is there mentioned might not be immediately recognizable. It is referred to as the power of making oneself large or small at will, And the reason of a description which appears so oddly to reverse the fact is that in reality the method by which this feat is performed is precisely that indicated in these ancient books. It is by the use of temporary visual machinery of inconceivable minuteness that the world of the infinitely little is so clearly seen, and in the same way, or rather in the opposite way, it is by temporarily enormously increasing the size of the machinery used that it becomes possible to increase the breadth of one's view in the physical sense as well as, let us hope, in the moral far beyond anything that science has ever dreamt of as possible for man. So that the alteration in size is really in the vehicle of the student's consciousness, and not in anything outside of himself, and the old Oriental book has, after all, put the case more accurately than we. Psychometry and second sight in excelsis would also be among the faculties which our friend would find at his command, but those will be more fitly dealt with under a later heading, since in almost all their manifestations they involve clairvoyance either in space or in time. 49. I have now indicated, though only in the roughest outlines, what a trained student, possessed of full astral vision, would see in the immensely wider world to which that vision introduced him. But I have said nothing of the stupendous change in his mental attitude which comes from the experiential certainty as to the existence of the soul, its survival after death, the action of the law of karma, and other points of equally paramount importance. The difference between even the profoundest intellectual conviction and the precise knowledge gained by direct personal experience must be felt in order to be appreciated. Chapter 4, Clairvoyance in Space, Intentional. We have defined this as the capacity to see events or scenes removed from the seer in space, and too far distant for ordinary observation. The instances of this are so numerous, and so various that we shall find it desirable to attempt a somewhat more detailed classification of them. It does not much matter what particular arrangement we adopt, so long as it is comprehensive enough to include all our cases. Perhaps a convenient one will be to group them under the broad divisions of intentional and unintentional clairvoyance in space, with an intermediate class that might be described as semi-intentional, a curious title. But I will explain it later. As before, I will begin by stating what is possible along this line for the fully trained seer, and endeavoring to explain how his faculty works, and under what limitations it acts. After that we shall find ourselves in a better position to try to understand the manifold examples of partial and untrained sight. 59. Let us then in the first place discuss intentional clairvoyance. It will be obvious from what has previously been said as to the power of astral vision, that anyone possessing it in its fullness will be able to see by its means practically anything in this world that he wishes to see. The most secret places are open to his gaze, and intervening obstacles have no existence for him, because of the change in his point of view, so that if we grant him the power of moving about in the astral body, he can without difficulty go anywhere, and see anything within the limits of the planet. Indeed, this is to a large extent possible to him even without the necessity of moving the astral body at all, as we shall presently see. Let us consider a little more closely the methods by which this superphysical sight may be used to observe events taking place at a distance. When, for example, a man here in England sees in minutest detail something which is happening at the same moment in India or America, how is it done? A very ingenious hypothesis has been offered to account for the phenomenon. It has been suggested that every object is perpetually throwing off radiations in all directions, similar in some respects to, though infinitely finer than, rays of light, and that clairvoyance is nothing but the power to see by means of these finer radiations. Distance would in that case 60 be no bar to the sight. All intervening objects would be penetrable by these rays, and they would be able to cross one another to infinity in all directions without entanglement, precisely as the vibrations of ordinary light do. Now, though this is not exactly the way in which clairvoyance works, the theory is nevertheless quite true in most of its premises. Every object undoubtedly is throwing off radiations in all directions, and it is precisely in this way, though on a higher plane, that the Akashic records seem to be formed. Of them it will be necessary to say something under our next heading, so we will do no more than mention them for the moment. The phenomena of psychometry are also dependent upon these radiations, as will presently be explained. There are, however, certain practical difficulties in the way of using these etheric vibrations, for that is, of course, what they are, as the medium by means of which one may see anything taking place at a distance. Intervening objects are not entirely transparent, and as the actors in the scene which the experimenter tried to observe would probably be at least equally transparent, it is obvious that serious confusion would be quite likely to result. The additional dimension, which would come into play if astral radiations were sensed instead of etheric, would obviate some of the difficulties, but would on 61, the other hand, introduce some fresh complications of its own, so that for practical purposes, in endeavoring to understand clairvoyance, we may dismiss this hypothesis of radiations from our minds, and turn to the methods of seeing at a distance which are actually at the disposal of the student. It will be found that there are 5, 4 of them being really varieties of clairvoyance, while the 5th does not properly come under that head at all, but belongs to the domain of magic. Let us take this last one first, and get it out of our way. 1. By the assistance of a nature spirit. This method does not necessarily involve the possession of any psychic faculty at all on the part of the experimenter. He need only know how to induce some denizen of the astral world to undertake the investigation for him. This may be done either by invocation or by evocation, that is to say, the operator may either persuade his astral coadjutor by prayers and offerings to give him the help he desires, or he may compel his aid by the determined exercise of a highly developed will. This method has been largely practiced in the East, where the entity employed is usually a nature spirit, and in old Atlantis, where the lords of the dark face used a highly specialized and peculiarly venomous variety of artificial elemental for this purpose. Information is sometimes obtained in the same sort of 62 way at the spiritualistic seance of modern days, but in that case the messenger employed is more likely to be a recently deceased human being functioning more or less freely on the astral plane, though even here also it is sometimes an obliging nature spirit, who is amusing himself by posing as somebody's departed relative. In any case, as I have said, this method is not clairvoyant at all, but magical, and it is mentioned here only in order that the reader may not become confused in the endeavor to classify cases of its use under some of the following headings. 2. By means of an astral current. This is a phrase frequently, and rather loosely employed in some of our theosophical literature to cover a considerable variety of phenomena, and among others that which I wish to explain. What is really done by the student who adopts this method is not so much the setting in motion of a current in astral matter, as the erection of a kind of temporary telephone through it. It is impossible here to give an exhaustive disquisition on astral physics, even had I the requisite knowledge to write it. All I need say is that it is possible to make in astral matter a definite connecting line that shall act as a telegraph wire to convey vibrations by means of which all that is going on at the other end of it may be seen. Such a line is established, be it understood, not by a direct projection through space of astral matter, but by such action upon a line, or 63, rather many lines, of particles of that matter as will render them capable of forming a conductor for vibrations of the character required. This preliminary action can be set up in 2 ways, either by the transmission of energy from particle to particle, until the line is formed, or by the use of a force from a higher plane which is capable of acting upon the whole line simultaneously. Of course, this latter method implies far greater development, since it involves the knowledge of, and the power to use, forces of a considerably higher level, so that the man who could make his line in this way would not, for his own use, need a line at all, since he could see far more easily, and completely by means of an altogether higher faculty. Even the simpler and purely astral operation is a difficult one to describe, though quite an easy one to perform. It may be said to partake somewhat of the nature of the magnetization of a bar of steel, for it consists in what we might call the polarization, by an effort of the human will, of a number of parallel lines of astral atoms reaching from the operator to the scene which he wishes to observe. All the atoms thus affected are held for the time with their axes rigidly parallel to one another, so that they form a kind of temporary tube along which the clairvoyant may look. This method has the disadvantage that the telegraph line is liable to disarrangement or even destruction by 64, any sufficiently strong astral current which happens to cross its path. But if the original effort of will were fairly definite, this would be a contingency of only infrequent occurrence. The view of a distant scene obtained by means of this astral current is in many ways not unlike that seen through a telescope. Human figures usually appear very small, like those on a distant stage, but in spite of their diminutive size they are as clear as though they were close by. Sometimes it is possible by this means to hear what is said as well as to see what is done, but as in the majority of cases this does not happen, we must consider it rather as the manifestation of an additional power than as a necessary corollary of the faculty of sight. It will be observed that in this case the seer does not usually leave his physical body at all. There is no sort of projection of his astral vehicle or of any part of himself towards that at which he is looking, but he simply manufactures for himself a temporary astral telescope. Consequently he has, to a certain extent, the use of his physical powers even while he is examining the distant scene. For example, his voice would usually still be under his control, so that he could describe what he saw even while he was in the act of making his observations. The consciousness of the man is, in fact, distinctly still at this end of the line. This fact, however, has its limitations as well as its 65 advantages, and these again largely resemble the limitations of the man using a telescope on the physical plane. The experimenter, for example, has no power to shift this point of view. His telescope, so to speak, has a particular field of view which cannot be enlarged or altered. He is looking at his scene from a certain direction, and he cannot suddenly turn it all round and see how it looks from the other side. If he has sufficient psychic energy to spare, he may drop altogether the telescope that he is using and manufacture an entirely new one for himself which will approach his objective somewhat differently. But this is not a course at all likely to be adopted in practice. But, it may be said, the mere fact that he is using astral sight ought to enable him to see it from all sides at once. So it would if he were using that sight in the normal way upon an object which was fairly near him within his astral reach, as it were. But at a distance of hundreds or thousands of miles the case is very different. Astral sight gives us the advantage of an additional dimension, but there is still such a thing as position in that dimension, and it is naturally a potent factor in limiting the use of the powers of its plane. Our ordinary three-dimensional sight enables us to see at once every point of the interior of a two-dimensional figure, such as a square, but in order to do that the square must be within a reasonable distance from our eyes. The mere additional dimension 66 will avail a man in London but little in his endeavor to examine a square in Calcutta. Astral sight, when it is cramped by being directed along what is practically a tube, is limited very much as physical sight would be under similar circumstances, though if possessed in perfection it will still continue to show, even at that distance, the auras, and therefore all the emotions, and most of the thoughts of the people under observation. There are many people for whom this type of clairvoyance is very much facilitated if they have at hand some physical object which can be used as a starting point for their astral tube, a convenient focus for their will power. A ball of crystal is the commonest and most effectual of such foci, since it has the additional advantage of possessing within itself qualities which stimulate psychic faculty, but other objects are also employed, to which we shall find it necessary to refer more particularly when we come to consider semi-intentional clairvoyance. In connection with this astral current form of clairvoyance, as with others, we find that there are some psychics who are unable to use it except when under the influence of mesmerism. The peculiarity in this case is that among such psychics there are two varieties, one in which by being thus set free the man is enabled to make a telescope for himself, and another in which the magnetizer himself makes the 67 telescope and the subject is simply enabled to see through it. In this latter case obviously the subject has not enough will to form a tube for himself, and the operator, though possessed of the necessary will power, is not clairvoyant, or he could see through his own tube without needing help. Occasionally, though rarely, The tube which is formed possesses another of the attributes of a telescope, that of magnifying the objects at which it is directed until they seem of life size. Of course, the objects must always be magnified to some extent, or they would be absolutely invisible, but usually the extent is determined by the size of the astral tube, and the whole thing is simply a tiny moving picture. In the few cases where the figures are seen as of life size by this method, it is probable that an altogether new power is beginning to dawn, but when this happens, careful observation is needed in order to distinguish them from examples of our next class. 3. By the projection of a thought form. The ability to use this method of clairvoyance implies a development somewhat more advanced than the last, since it necessitates a certain amount of control upon the mental plane. All students of theosophy are aware that thought takes form, at any rate upon its own plane, and in the vast majority of cases upon the astral plane also, but it may not be quite so generally known that if a man thinks strongly of himself as present at 68, any given place, the form assumed by that particular thought will be a likeness of the thinker himself, which will appear at the place in question. Essentially, this form must be composed of the matter of the mental plane, but in very many cases it would draw round itself matter of the astral plane also, and so would approach much nearer to visibility. There are, in fact, many instances in which it has been seen by the person thought of most probably by means of the unconscious mesmeric influence emanating from the original thinker. None of the consciousness of the thinker would, however, be included within this thought form. When once sent out from him, it would normally be a quite separate entity, not indeed absolutely unconnected with its maker, but practically so as far as the possibility of receiving any impression through it is concerned. This third type of clairvoyance consists, then, in the power to retain so much connection with and so much hold over a newly erected thought form, as will render it possible to receive impressions by means of it. Such impressions as were made upon the form would in this case be transmitted to the thinker not along an astral telegraph line, as before, but by sympathetic vibration. In a perfect case of this kind of clairvoyance, it is almost as though the seer projected a part of his consciousness into the thought form, and used it as a kind of outpost, from which observation was 69 possible. He sees almost as well as he would if he himself stood in the place of his thought form. The figures at which he is looking will appear to him as of life size and close at hand, instead of tiny and at a distance, as in the previous case, and he will find it possible to shift his point of view if he wishes to do so. Clairaudience is perhaps less frequently associated with this type of clairvoyance than with the last, but its place is to some extent taken by a kind of mental perception of the thoughts and intentions of those who are seen. Since the man's consciousness is still in the physical body, he will be able, even while exercising the faculty, to hear and to speak, in so far as he can do this without any distraction of his attention. The moment that the intentness of his thought fails, the whole vision is gone, and he will have to construct a fresh thought form before he can resume it. Instances in which this kind of sight is possessed with any degree of perfection by untrained people are naturally rarer than in the case of the previous type, because of the capacity for mental control required, and the generally finer nature of the forces employed. 4. By traveling in the astral body. We enter here upon an entirely new variety of clairvoyance, in which the consciousness of the seer no longer remains in or closely connected with his physical body, but is definitely transferred to the scene which he is x70 a meaning. Though it has no doubt greater dangers for the untrained seer than either of the methods previously described, it is yet quite the most satisfactory form of clairvoyance open to him, for the immensely superior variety, which we shall consider under our fifth head, is not available except for specially trained students. In this case the man's body is either asleep or in trance, and its organs are consequently not available for use while the vision is going on, so that all description of what is seen, and all questioning as to further particulars, must be postponed until the wanderer returns to this plane. On the other hand, the sight is much fuller and more perfect. The man hears as well as sees everything which passes before him, and can move about freely at will within the very wide limits of the astral plane. He can see and study at leisure all the other inhabitants of that plane, so that the great world of the nature spirits, of which the traditional fairy land is but a very small part, lies open before him, and even that of some of the lower devas. He has also the immense advantage of being able to take part, as it were, in the scenes which come before his eyes of conversing at will with these various astral entities, from whom so much information that is curious and interesting may be obtained. If in addition he can learn how to materialize himself, a matter of no great difficulty for him when once the 71 knack is acquired, he will be able to take part in physical events or conversations at a distance, and to show himself to an absent friend at will. Again, he has the additional power of being able to hunt about for what he wants. By means of the varieties of clairvoyance previously described, for all practical purposes he could find a person or a place only when he was already acquainted with it, or when he was put en rapport with it by touching something physically connected with it, as in psychometry. It is true that by the third method a certain amount of motion is possible, but the process is a tedious one except for quite short distances. By the use of the astral body, however, a man can move about quite freely and rapidly in any direction, and can, for example, find without difficulty any place pointed out upon a map, without either any previous knowledge of the spot or any object to establish a connection with it. He can also readily rise high into the air so as to gain a bird's-eye view of the country which he is examining, so as to observe its extent, the contour of its coastline, or its general character. Indeed, in every way his power and freedom are far greater when he uses this method than they have been in any of the previous cases. A good example of the full possession of this power is given, on the authority of the German writer Jung Stilling, by Mrs. Crowe in The Night Side of Nature 72, p. 127. The story is related of a seer who is stated to have resided in the neighborhood of Philadelphia, in America. His habits were retired, and he spoke little. He was grave, benevolent and pious, and nothing was known against his character except that he had the reputation of possessing some secrets that were considered not altogether lawful. Many extraordinary stories were told of him, and amongst the rest the following: the wife of a ship captain, whose husband was on a voyage to Europe and Africa, and from whom she had been long without tidings, being overwhelmed with anxiety for his safety, was induced to address herself to this person. Having listened to her story, he begged her to excuse him for a while, when he would bring her the intelligence she required. He then passed into an inner room, and she sat herself down to wait, but his absence continuing longer than she expected, she became impatient, thinking he had forgotten her, and softly approaching the door she peeped through some aperture, and to her surprise beheld him lying on a sofa as motionless as if he were dead. She of course did not think it advisable to disturb him, but waited his return, when he told her that her husband had not been able to write to her for such and such reasons, but that he was then in a coffee-house in London, and would very shortly be home again. 73. Accordingly he arrived, and as the lady learnt from him that the causes of his unusual silence had been precisely those alleged by the man, she felt extremely desirous of ascertaining the truth of the rest of the information. In this she was gratified, for he no sooner set his eyes on the magician than he said that he had seen him before on a certain day in a coffee-house in London, and that he told him that his wife was extremely uneasy about him, and that he, the captain, had thereon mentioned how he had been prevented writing, adding that he was on the eve of embarking for America. He had then lost sight of the stranger amongst the throng, and knew nothing more about him. We have of course no means now of knowing what evidence Jung Stilling had of the truth of this story, though he declares himself to have been quite satisfied with the authority on which he relates it. But so many similar things have happened, that there is no reason to doubt its accuracy. The seer, however, must either have developed his faculty for himself or learnt it in some school other than that from which most of our theosophical information is derived, for in our case there is a well-understood regulation expressly forbidding the pupils from giving any manifestation of such power which can be definitely proved at both ends in that way, and so constitute what is called a phenomenon. That this regulation is 74, emphatically a wise one, is proved to all who know anything of the history of our society by the disastrous results which followed from a very slight temporary relaxation of it. I have given some quite modern cases almost exactly parallel to the above in my little book on invisible helpers. An instance of a lady well known to myself, who frequently thus appears to friends at a distance, is given by Mr. Stead in Real Ghost Stories, p. 27, and Mr. Andrew Lang gives, in his Dreams and Ghosts, p. 89, an account of how Mr. Cleeve, then at Portsmouth, appeared intentionally on 2 occasions to a young lady in London, and alarmed her considerably. There is any amount of evidence to be had on the subject by anyone who cares to study it seriously. This paying of intentional astral visits seems very often to become possible when the principles are loosened at the approach of death for people who were unable to perform such a feat at any other time. There are even more examples of this class than of the other. I epitomize a good one given by Mr. Andrew Lang on p. 100 of the book last cited, one of which he himself says, "Not many stories have such good evidence in their favor." Mary, the wife of John Gough of Rochester, being afflicted with a long illness, removed to her father's house at West Malling, about 9 miles from her own. 75. The day before her death she grew very impatiently desirous to see her 2 children, whom she had left at home to the care of a nurse. She was too ill to be moved, and between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning she fell into a trance. One widow Turner, who watched with her that night, says that her eyes were open and fixed, and her jaw fallen. Mrs. Turner put her hand upon her mouth, but could perceive no breath. She thought her to be in a fit, and doubted whether she were dead or alive. The next morning the dying woman told her mother that she had been at home with her children, saying, "I was with them last night when I was asleep." The nurse at Rochester, widow Alexander by name, affirms that a little before 2 o'clock that morning she saw the likeness of the said Mary Gough come out of the next chamber, where the elder child lay in a bed by itself, the door being left open, and stood by her bedside for about a quarter of an hour. The younger child was there lying by her. Her eyes moved and her mouth went, but she said nothing. The nurse, moreover, says that she was perfectly awake. It was then daylight, being one of the longest days in the year. She sat up in bed, and looked steadfastly on the apparition. In that time she heard the bridge clock strike 2, and a while after said, "In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, what art thou?" Thereupon the apparition 76, removed and went away. She slipped on her clothes and followed, but what became on't, she cannot tell. The nurse apparently was more frightened by its disappearance than its presence, for after this she was afraid to stay in the house, and so spent the rest of the time until 6 o'clock in walking up and down outside. When the neighbors were awake she told her tale to them, and they of course said she had dreamt it all. She naturally enough warmly repudiated that idea, but could obtain no credence until the news of the other side of the story arrived from West Malling, when people had to admit that there might have been something in it. A noteworthy circumstance in this story is that the mother found it necessary to pass from ordinary sleep into the profounder trance condition before she could consciously visit her children. It can, however, be paralleled here and there among the large number of similar accounts which may be found in the literature of the subject. 2 other stories of precisely the same type in which a dying mother, earnestly desiring to see her children, falls into a deep sleep, visits them and returns to say that she has done so, are given by Dr. F.G. Lee. In one of them the mother, when dying in Egypt, appears to her children at Torquay, and is clearly seen in broad daylight by all 5 of the children, and also by the nursemaid. Glimpses of 77, The Supernatural, Volume 2, p. 64. In the other a Quaker lady dying at Cockermouth is clearly seen and recognized in daylight by her 3 children at Settle, the remainder of the story being practically identical with the one given above. Glimpses in the Twilight, p. 94. Though these cases appear to be less widely known than that of Mary Gough, the evidence of their authenticity seems to be quite as good, as will be seen by the attestations obtained by the reverend author of the works from which they are quoted. The man who fully possesses this 4th type of clairvoyance has many and great advantages at his disposal, even in addition to those already mentioned. Not only can he visit without trouble or expense all the beautiful and famous places of the earth, but if he happens to be a scholar, Think what it must mean to him that he has access to all the libraries of the world. What must it be for the scientifically minded man to see taking place before his eyes so many of the processes of the secret chemistry of nature, or for the philosopher to have revealed to him so much more than ever before of the working of the great mysteries of life and death? To him those who are gone from this plane are dead no longer, but living and within reach for a long time to come. For him many of the conceptions of religion are no longer matters of faith, but of knowledge. Above all, he 78, can join the army of invisible helpers, and really be of use on a large scale. Undoubtedly clairvoyance, even when confined to the astral plane, is a great boon to the student. Certainly it has its dangers also, especially for the untrained, danger from evil entities of various kinds, which may terrify or injure those who allow themselves to lose the courage to face them boldly, danger of deception of all sorts, of misconceiving and misinterpreting what is seen, greatest of all, the danger of becoming conceited about the thing, and of thinking it impossible to make a mistake. But a little common sense and a little experience should easily guard a man against these. 5. By traveling in the mental body. This is simply a higher and, as it were, glorified form of the last type. The vehicle employed is no longer the astral body, but the mind-body, a vehicle, therefore, belonging to the mental plane, and having within it all the potentialities of the wonderful sense of that plane, so transcendent in its action yet so impossible to describe. A man functioning in this leaves his astral body behind him along with the physical, and if he wishes to show himself upon the astral plane for any reason, he does not send for his own astral vehicle, but just by a single action of his will materializes one for his temporary need. Such an astral materialization is sometimes called the Maya Virupa, and to form 79, it for the first time usually needs the assistance of a qualified master. The enormous advantages given by the possession of this power are the capacity of entering upon all the glory and the beauty of the higher land of bliss, and the possession, even when working on the astral plane, of the far more comprehensive mental sense which opens up to the student such marvelous vistas of knowledge, and practically renders error all but impossible. This higher flight, however, is possible for the trained man only, since only under definite training can a man at this stage of evolution learn to employ his mental body as a vehicle. Before leaving the subject of full and intentional clairvoyance, it may be well to devote a few words to answering one or two questions as to its limitations, which constantly occur to students. Is it possible, we are often asked, for the seer to find any person with whom he wishes to communicate, anywhere in the world, whether he be living or dead? To this reply must be a conditional affirmative. Yes, it is possible to find any person if the experimenter can, in some way or other, put himself en rapport with that person. It would be hopeless to plunge vaguely into space to find a total stranger among all the millions around us without any kind of clue, but, on the other hand, a very slight clue would usually be sufficient. 80. If the clairvoyant knows anything of the man whom he seeks, he will have no difficulty in finding him, for every man has what may be called a kind of musical chord of his own, a chord, which is the expression of him as a whole, produced perhaps by a sort of average of the rates of vibration of all his different vehicles on their respective planes. If the operator knows how to discern that chord and to strike it, it will by sympathetic vibration attract the attention of the man instantly wherever he may be, and will evoke an immediate response from him. Whether the man were living or recently dead would make no difference at all, and clairvoyants of the 5th class could at once find him even among the countless millions in the heaven world, though in that case the man himself would be unconscious that he was under observation. Naturally a seer whose consciousness did not range higher than the astral plane, who employed therefore one of the earlier methods of seeing, would not be able to find a person upon the mental plane at all. Yet even he would at least be able to tell that the man sought for was upon that plane, from the mere fact that the striking of the chord as far up as the astral level produced no response. If the man sought be a stranger to the seeker, the latter will need something connected with him to act as a clue, a photograph, a letter written by him, an 81, article which has belonged to him, and is impregnated with his personal magnetism, any of these would do in the hands of a practiced seer. Again I say, it must not therefore be supposed that pupils who have been taught how to use this art are at liberty to set up a kind of intelligence office through which communication can be had with missing or dead relatives. A message given from this side to such an one might or might not be handed on, according to circumstances, but even if it were, no reply might be brought, lest the transaction should partake of the nature of a phenomenon, something which could be proved on the physical plane to have been an act of magic. Another question often raised is as to whether, in the action of psychic vision, there is any limitation as to distance. The reply would seem to be that there should be no limit, but that of the respective planes. It must be remembered that the astral and mental planes of our Earth are as definitely its own as its atmosphere, though they extend considerably further from it even in our three-dimensional space than does the physical air. Consequently, the passage to, or the detailed sight of, other planets would not be possible for any system of clairvoyance connected with these planes. It is quite possible and easy for the man who can raise his consciousness to the Buddhic plane to pass to any other globe belonging 82 to our chain of worlds, but that is outside our present subject. Still, a good deal of additional information about other planets can be obtained by the use of such clairvoyant faculties as we have been describing. It is possible to make sight enormously clearer by passing outside of the constant disturbances of the Earth's atmosphere, and it is also not difficult to learn how to put on an exceedingly high magnifying power, so that even by ordinary clairvoyance a good deal of very interesting astronomical knowledge may be gained. But as far as this Earth and its immediate surroundings are concerned, there is practically no limitation. 83. End of Part 1. Continue listening to Clairvoyance by C.W. Leadbeater on Part 2 of this audiobook.